Hello, St. Paul's. I'm Liza, and I'd like to talk to you just a little bit about the vocation and the role of lay people within the Episcopal Church. As many of you know, I'm a theology professor up at the College of St. Scholastica, and I'm also very active in leadership within the Episcopal Church. I serve on the Executive Council, which is sort of the church-wide board of directors. I serve on the General Board of Examining Chaplains, which writes and grades the ordination exams that future clergy have to take. And I'm a past member of the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music, which helps to write the liturgies that we use together. I'm also a committed layperson. And this is frankly a matter of some confusion to many people. People who meet me and hear the kinds of things that I'm active in doing tend to automatically assume that I'm a priest. And when they find that I'm not, the very next question is where I'm at in the ordination process, because obviously I must be in the ordination process. And when they find out that I'm not that either, invariably, the very next thing is that people assume that I must be married to a priest. And they think that it's so nice that I'm at whatever this gathering is, like just as someone's wife. And I'm so supportive of my wonderful hypothetical spouse who definitely doesn't exist. So one of the things that I love about the Episcopal tradition in theory is that we actually give a tremendous scope to the importance of lay ministry and to the role of the laity at all levels of church work. It is, however, often the reality that we fall short of our own ideals and have not fully lived into them. I think we've done a really good job as a denomination in trying to expand the language of calling and vocation so that it doesn't just mean church vocations, right? Each Christian, each person indeed, has a particular calling in the world. And I know that before I came to St. Paul's, you've done quite a bit of work as a congregation on how to develop a culture of calling and help each person to discern a calling. However, I think that we often still tend to assume that if you are called to some kind of church vocation, that's just what ordination means, right? If you're called to do this church thing absolutely 24/7, well, that's inherently a call to ordination. And I'd like to challenge that. I think we can often talk about this whole concept of the priesthood of all believers, or the vocation of each Christian, in a couple of unhelpful ways. One is to say that all Christian vocations are basically alike. Each person has one, you figure out what yours is, and if yours happens to be a call to leadership in the church, well, then you should be ordained. But if your vocation is to, be a shoemaker, you should go be a shoemaker, right? And that these are all equal in value, but that the church vocations, that's simply what ordination is. And what that can lend itself to is a kind of professional credentialing model of ordination where, that's simply what ordination becomes. Something like a lay professional doesn't even make any sense. To be a professional is by nature to be ordained. And, lay people might do something like preach or teach or help out liturgically, maybe, but you basically sort of then are treating them as junior unpaid assistants, and that professional ministry is by definition clerical ministry. My fear, quite frankly, is that we're going more and more in this direction. And especially actually as we move more and more towards sort of part-time and bivocational forms of ministry, where a priest does not necessarily have seminary training. A priest might have another full-time job, but increasingly, we need priests to help out on Sundays. And so ordination becomes the professional stamp of approval you put on someone's lay ministry in order to allow them to distribute the sacraments. Many other Christian denominations have a kind of vocations crisis within ordained ministry and are experiencing a real lack of people who feel called to ordination. That's actually not our problem, I think. If you look at raw numbers, if you look at number of Episcopal priests who are being ordained versus priests who retire, or if you look at the number of new priests versus open congregations, it does kind of look like we have a vocations crisis in terms of ordained ministry. But if you look at the number of priests as a percentage of active membership, we're actually rapidly clericalizing every year because we have so many smaller congregations that cannot support a priest financially, and yet still need some kind of pastoral leadership in the congregation. And so what starts happening is you start ordaining people for a smaller and smaller number of lay people. And it becomes the case that once you're sort of incredibly active in the church at all, there will in fact be tremendous pressure to be ordained so that you can help out in times of scarcity. The other model that prevails, which unfortunately is very common, is a kind of functionalist model. And we try to explain these different roles and vocations in the church based on what they do, right? So within the Episcopal Church, we have bishops and priests and deacons. We also have monks and nuns, and we have lay people. And in theory, you might be able to discern a vocation into any one of these things. So how do you know what the difference is? If God is calling you to something, which of these things might that be? Well, the unfortunate answer that we often give kind of carves them up in terms of functions, right? So deacons serve. And so if you're called to a ministry of service and social justice, that's a call to the diaconate. Priests are in charge of preaching and teaching and administering the sacraments. Bishops exercise governance and oversight. Monastics pray. And lay people. What do lay people do? Basically, what we end up with is that lay people do secular stuff. The idea of a lay person who's called primarily into church work doesn't make any kind of sense at all. We had a document written a few years ago by our House of Bishops Ecclesiology Committee. This was about 5 years ago now, but I'm still mad about it, so I'm going to tell you about it. This actual document goes through all of the different orders of ministry and talks about the importance of each one and what each of them does and what their vocation is. And when it comes to the lay people, it actually says that the vocation of the lay people is to maintain the properties of the church and to provide money for the rector to use in ministry. Well, sign me up for that exciting adventure of Christian discipleship, right? Like, I get to give money and maintain the properties. Thrilling. Who wouldn't want to do that? No wonder we don't have people lining up to want to join our churches when that's what we're offering them as some kind of vocational path, right? So I understand why we often think that way and why we want to carve out each of these things as an important thing. But what does that say about why anyone should want to be a Christian in the first place, right? If the only thing that you're really given to do is the secular world side of the church that you might do just as well even without the church. I had a bishop tell me once that there was no such thing as a lay theologian or such thing as lay ministry. He said that lay theologians are just the kind of thing that happens in a church like the Roman Catholic Church, where they won't recognize the ordained vocations of everyone. So according to him, the only way you'd end up with something strange like a lay theologian is if you're in a tradition where a woman or a married man is barred from being a priest, and so therefore they can't exercise their true vocation. And a lay theologian is just this kind of anomalous, freakish thing that happens that really shouldn't happen. And he actually said that, like, my whole existence is undermining the entire ecclesiology of the Episcopal Church, which I was really rather proud of. It's like, wow, I've undermined an entire ecclesiology before I even had my morning coffee. What will I do next? I don't want us to be that kind of church, right? Where, we just carve all of these things up into functions. Because from the perspective of Christianity, I would say that all of these are completely false binaries. Clergy versus lay, sacred versus secular, spiritual versus material, contemplation versus action. We often use this kind of binary thinking, but when God became human in Christ and took flesh and entered into the material world, God joined the material and the spiritual permanently. There can be no opposition or no binary. And I would argue that the uniqueness of Christianity and the role of Christianity is that joining of action and contemplation, of secular and profane, of secular and sacred, of material and spiritual. And I would argue that this is actually precisely what we do in the sacraments and in the Christian tradition of contemplative prayer. So I want to give you a different vision of what the priesthood of all believers is. If we look at the New Testament, there's a couple of different words used for priest. One of them is presbyter, which is elder. And this is basically what our priests are in the Episcopal Church. They're presbyters, if we're being technical. The New Testament nowhere suggests that we have a presbyterate of all believers, that each person is sort of a governing elder unto ourselves, and we're all just running around in some kind of anarchy. That would be a disaster. You'll definitely find Christians who think about the priesthood of all believers in that way, where we're all basically just sort of, we're all in charge, that's what it means. But it's not. Instead, the word that's used for priest in that context is hieros, which specifically describes the sacramental action of the priesthood. So what does that mean for a layperson? Well, I would argue that what we're actually doing in the sacraments is we're taking material things like bread and wine and water and holy baptism, oil for chrismation and anointing, and we're making them sacred. And we're using them to work for the sanctification of the world. And it is the whole world, not just people. Christians are described as priests for the world. And I think when we forget about the world and the material creation, what actually often happens is that lay people take the place of the world. Lay people become the kind of inert matter on which the ordained clergy exercise their vocation to form us. But actually, all of us have that kind of priestly vocation vis-a-vis the world. And the role specifically of laity, I think, in the sacraments is the contemplative vocation. Now, it's one of the great debates within the history of philosophy, sort of what is the role of action versus contemplation? How do you relate these two things to each other? Historically, most Christians have said contemplation is better. You have some very interesting minority reports, including by a medieval theologian named Meister Eckhart, whom I love. But mostly Christians have tended to say contemplation is better. And they tend to think of contemplation as being sort of what the clergy do and the laity do action. I would argue that what we actually see enacted in our liturgy is something very different, where it is in fact the role of the laity to exercise that prayerful contemplative vocation, where we are the ones uniting materiality to spirituality in our prayers. And in some ways, the clergy are the ones who are called to descend into the world of action, as is necessary when charity demands that. But that both of these properly go together, and that private prayer basically is enacting that on a micro level. So I'm going to finish with this thought and maybe leave this for you to think about. But I would argue that this is actually what unites Christian ritual and Christian sacrament with Christian contemplative prayer. Christian contemplative prayer is actually just the interiorization of the same thing. So many Christian texts of mysticism and ascetical theology speak of the heart as the altar on which we offer sacrifices, in the same way that we offer bread and wine on the altar in church. And so each of our prayers that we bring and offer upon our heart actually is an offering in parallel to the Eucharistic offering. And it's a kind of interior liturgy that takes place continually in union with the exterior liturgy that we also perform, and that both are necessary. And I know that for many of us, certainly for me, it is a hardship and a sadness when we're not able to participate in person in that exterior kind of liturgy. But what many of these early Christian mystics would challenge all of us on is that ideally, this interior kind of liturgy and the exterior liturgy should always go together. And yet, it is the reality that all the time, all of us, I am sure, have participated in the exterior liturgy without that interior contemplative work taking place. And so why then must we feel more distressed when we are deprived of the exterior and yet still have the interior? Again, ideally, these should always go together. But if we are currently deprived of one of them, the truth is that we were often deprived of one of them all along. It's just we were deprived of the interior one. And I think it may be that this time in which we don't have the exterior liturgy to participate in the same way is really a time to strengthen that interior contemplative dimension of our vocation and to really heighten that, in the hopes that when we can again bring them back together and celebrate them in unity as they are meant to be, that the contemplative interior dimension will in fact be stronger because of this period of time when we are withdrawn from the external liturgy. I've rambled at you for long enough. I appreciate your patience in listening to me, and I look forward to seeing all of you again soon.